Hi, and welcome back to my third in the series of taking the mystery out of photography. I hope you've been enjoying the series so far. I'm trying to stick with this. I don't know. I've got several on in the preamble underneath or the notes underneath. You'll find what my forthcoming subjects might be. They may be out of order, but that's basically, I'm going to try and stick to some of that. And of course, there's a lot more to photography than just those topics there. So anyway, welcome back. Today we are looking at ISO, or in the old days of film, it was called ASA. I should have looked up what ASA used to stand for, but ISO is standing something else. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some films, some old films, and a couple of cameras. And then I've got a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation to illuminate and take some of the mystery out of what is ISO, or ISO, some people call it. Before I get into that, I have used a few quotes from, or a couple of quotes from this book here, which I might have talked about earlier on my YouTube channel. This is a really good book that's available in bookshops at the moment. It's Digital Photography, the Complete Course, Everything You Need to Know in 20 Weeks. And it's by DK Publishing House. And it's a beautifully laid out book. And if I had students with me at the moment, we would probably work our way through some of that, apart from the material that I've prepared in my own training material. It's a very good reference book for the modern photographer. Of course, you can get similar books from the old days all about film photography, and they're good as well. So if you're into film, you should hunt around in the bookshops for the old film photography books that show you how to do things. Anyway, where are we up to now? So couple of cameras. This one I showed, I think, in episode 1. This was the Pentax Super program, or Super A, and this is a film camera, and you can set the ISO. You have to either set on film cameras, and you have to set the ISO manually, and sometimes on your digital camera you'll want to set it manually too, but it'll do automatically for you. This camera here, I'll show you some pictures in a minute, but it's a little bit different. But just over here, there's a, where are we? Just got my finger just there. There is a, just below there. See there? There's an ISO or ASA window there, and it's got in there at the moment, it's got 400 in there. So this film that's in this camera at the moment is actually rated at ASA 400, which is really the same as ISO 400. And in the back, you can see that I put this little, I tore this off the back of the film carton, and that shows me that I've got a 36 exposure Fuji color film in there, Superior Extra it's called, but I've also written on there 400 to make sure that I know that I've got a 400 film in there, even though I've got this up here. So that's in there. It's got 400 registered in there, but I've also got a note of it here, so I know what I'm doing when I'm using that camera. With digital cameras, you'll have a setting for a digital camera that you can set it manually. On this one here, this is a Nikon. I didn't want to show you that one because that doesn't actually show you how to do it. What do I do with the other one there? There was a Pentax I had here a minute ago. You put things down and you don't know what you do with them. Anyway, goodness knows, that might turn up in a minute. Maybe it's over here. Here it is, over here. Okay. So this is a Pentax KX, and on the back here, you can see just there's a switch there where you can set the ISO there on that one there, just where my finger is there. And on the menu, of course, you can change the settings as well. So with digital cameras, you can change the ISO. You don't, once you put a film in a film camera, you don't change the ISO unless you want to manipulate the film a bit, shoot it at a different rating to what it is. Sometimes you can do that, but that's a whole nother subject. That's getting away from the simple part of photography. So we'll just talk about film to start with. So for instance, back in the early days, this was a Kodachrome film. I don't know whether this has been exposed or not. I've still got a tag hanging out there. But this is the sort of film that I started with back in the 1970. was this sort of film, Kodachrome. This had 20 exposures, and this was rated at ASA 25 or ISO 25. So it's what you'd call a very slow film. And you mainly use that in bright daylight. If you're in a darker condition, you'd have to set the camera on a tripod and slow the shutter speed right down. So, and then you get, this is another one here, a black and white Kodak panchromatic film. This is a 120 film, medium format film. And the setting on the ISO or ASA on this one is 125. You might better see it there. See there on the, just down below May 1970, which is the end processing date, use by date. It's got the ASA 125. So usually on the box or and on the film, you will find films with, this is a black and white film, Ilford Pan F. It's a 120 film, and it's got ASA 50 there, and also it's got DIN 18 and ASA 50 with the same thing. You'll find films also were rated in the DIN regulation, but you don't really need to worry about that. I never knew what it stood for, and all you needed to know was the ASA. So that's a little bit about some of the films, even on a little 110 cartridge film here. This has got 24 exposures on there, but that's set at ASA 200. Now, with your films, with the modern film SLR cameras, you notice on here there's a little thing that says DX. See that DX there? That indicates that once you put that film in an automatic film camera, the camera will automatically read what the ASA or ISO is and set that accordingly on your camera. But if you have a film or an older camera that doesn't do that, you have to set the ASA rating yourself, manually yourself. So let's have a little bit of look. I've got a little bit of a PowerPoint thing I've done here. I'm not going to labor too long on this. There are some very good things on, like, I don't know whether any of you look at Tony and Chelsea Northrup, Northrup. They've got a really good tutorial on what ISO is all about that Tony does. So I'd suggest you look that up if you want a bit more in-depth information than what I'm giving you here, but I'm trying to keep it simple. It's very hard sometimes, of course, to keep things simple, but we're going to start off with a bit of a philosophy idea here to, let me see here. I'm going to share the screen with you. Let's have a go at that. Share the screen. So now you should be seeing that, and I'm going to look at this as a slideshow, play from the start. Now you should have that whole slideshow of my PowerPoint. I've been working on this morning for a little while, but it's not going to be too long. So taking the mystery out of photography. ISO, or in the old days, film days, it was called ASA. ISO and ASA ratings are the same. Films also used to have a DIN rating, which you don't need to be concerned about. I just mentioned that, didn't I? Okay, so here we have the first car I'm going to show you. My young son had a car similar to this, and this was a classic Holden, EH Holden, and he had one fully restored like that for a while as well. So cars and cameras, the changing technology. And we're going to just talk a little bit about that as we go. We're going to look at some cars, and we're going to look at some f-stops and settings on the cameras from shots that I've taken of some of these cars, and a few other things as well. So enjoy this as we continue through the PowerPoint presentation. This one here, this is my son has quite keen on cars, and he's been along to a group that runs, they have displays in supermarket or in car parks in shopping centres, and they call it Coffee and Chrome, and they're all enthusiasts about all these cars. But look at this. This is an older technology here. You might know what car it is. I don't know what it is. But no screens and technology here. But wouldn't you love this technology? You know, on these latest cars, of course, they're all singing and dancing. We don't have one of those. But you don't necessarily need to have the latest things to enjoy your technology, do you? And look at that. That's my youngest son had one of those cars, a Holden EH. back in the day, which had been fully restored and was in as good as condition as that. Lovely car, but once again, and these cars were all automatic, of course. In the early days, before you had automatic transmission, you had to change the gears manually. And now most cars come out are automatic. But and that would have been an automatic one, that one there, I think. This was my favourite car that I had for a while. I sold it a couple of years ago, a Toyota Camry. That was about a 2001 model, I think. But that's an automatic car, but not an all singing and dancing one like the latest things. And the thing that I liked about it most, it had a cassette player in it, although that died after a while. And there you are. There's back to the coffee and chrome day that they were having in a shopping centre car park. Now, this is just showing you on here, because I took these photos on a digital camera, I was able to tell you what the ISO setting was and what the aperture was and what the shutter speed was on this particular shot. So the ISO, and I would have taken this on programmed auto exposure on my camera. I didn't set anything manually, but the camera chose ISO 400, an aperture of f5, which gives me reasonable depth of field on a shot like that, and a speed of an 80th of a second. It was a bright sunny day, and that exposure worked quite well. And you would say that that's for the type of shot it is, that's pretty much a correct exposure, a correct creative exposure, except that if I wanted to get more detail in all of that engine there, I might have changed the aperture to up something like f16, and then those other values would have changed. And there we are out in the car park where some of the cars are lined up. Beautiful cars, some of these. And that one there, because it's brighter sunlight, the camera has chosen automatically an ASA rating or ISO rating of 100 and an f-stop, that's the aperture we've been talking about previously, of f7.1, and a shutter speed of 125th of a second. So on a bright sunny day, that's the sort of settings you can use and get nice photography. With the f7.1, you get a reasonably good depth of field in that shot, so everything's sort of in focus pretty much. And that's one of our current cars, which is an older model. It's about 20 years, 21 years old now, but we love it. But it's got none of the bells and whistles, but it is automatic. It's not a manual car. Toyota again. Now, getting back to our cameras. So here's, similar to the camera I showed you last week, this is the Pentax Spotmatic 2. This was my first camera that I started shooting weddings on, really. Now, you just see there it says ASA setting window. So just below the G on that writing there, you can see a little window, and then it's got ASA in red underneath it, and in the window it's set for 200. So in that camera at the time, I had a film set at ASA 200. In today's terminology, ISO 200. And on other cameras, of course, you have a different place where you can actually set on other film cameras, like I think I showed you on the other one, where you can set the ISO or ASA. Now, this is a Canon 600D, and you can see the ISO button there where I've got it highlighted there. You can quickly go to that. I've got the camera set in program there, but I can quickly go to the ISO and change the ISO if I want to. We'll just move on and show you on the back. So there you go. There's another ISO button on that wheel area there on the back, which is duplicated on the screen. You can see the ISO there on the right. And then in the screen halfway down, it says ISO Auto 400. So I've got the camera set on program there. That's out in daylight. And the camera has chosen, in those lighting conditions, it's chosen 400 ISO, an 80th of a second, and f4. And there's more things there. I've got it on that's a Pentax, and you can see that little hand down there with the vibrations around the hand, the green hand. That means that there's inbuilt stabilization on all the Pentax cameras, and that's really handy because it whatever lens you put on the camera, it keeps the camera steady. Sorry, this is a Canon, not the Pentax. The Pentax does that. But the Canon camera actually has that built in onto the lens on this particular one. Excuse me. So what is ISO? That stands for International Organization for Standardization. Wow. I think I've got standardization spelt wrongly there, but that doesn't matter. So changing ISO affects the light sensitivity of a digital camera's sensor. Excuse me. On a digital camera, the camera can choose an ISO for you automatically. Your iPhone does the same thing, actually, depending on the scene you are capturing and the shutter speed and aperture being used. You can choose what ISO you want to use manually also, but the camera, if you've got the camera set on program, you can set it on automatic ISO and it will choose the one that the camera thinks you should be using for that particular scene. On films, you have to change your film and ISO depending on the light available. Films which were set in their degree of sensitivity were rated according to the conditions you were using them in. If you went from a bright sunny day to darkening shadows in the late afternoon, you usually had to change your film from a slower speed to a faster one to capture the light. Or if you were shooting at a wedding, you might have been using a slower film outside in the bright sunlight, but when you go inside a dimly lit church, you might want to change it up to a 400 or an 800 ISO ASA film. So if you went from a bright sunny day to darkening shadows in the late afternoon, we're talking about films here, you usually had to change your film from a slower speed to a faster one to capture light. The game really changed when digital cameras came in, because I always had to be very careful when I was shooting weddings to shoot my last daylight shots at least half an hour before sunset, because I knew then that the films that I had with me were okay in that sort of lighting, like the ASA 400 was okay half an hour before sunset. But after that, I was starting to struggle a bit and might need a tripod. But when you got digital cameras, you could just change the ISO when you wanted to change with the lighting conditions. So how will ISO affect my photography? Is a crucial part of the photographic triangle. You do need to be aware of what it does, or you can choose to just point and shoot your digital camera. So how does ISO interact with shutter speed and aperture? All three of these settings can change your exposure to how you want it to look, or you can let your camera choose for you. A high ISO is necessary if you want to use a faster shutter speed or a smaller aperture in low light. A low ISO is typically used in normal shooting conditions and might be appropriate where you want more detail and less noise or grain in your image. So in the old days, if you had a low ASA film, well, then usually was very fine grained. The higher up you went in the rating, you got more grain in the shot. And it's the same with digital cameras. If you've got a digital camera that can get you down to ISO 50 or ISO 100, you're going to get a lot less noise in the shot that you take. Whereas the higher speeds, a lot of these cameras will take photos in just about any light with a very high ISO speeds, but you will lose some of that detail. You'll get some grain in that, which you might not want. Sometimes it's quite effective, particularly if you change the shot to a black and white shot. So let's have a look at a couple of examples here. I haven't got too many. A couple of weekends ago, we were on a holiday in Balranald in New South Wales, and this was in a big wool shed in there. Now, it was actually quite dark in there, but okay to look at with the naked eye. But looking with my naked eye, I didn't see it like that. But if I set the camera was set on program, and this was using my Canon 700D, I think. And the ISO that the camera chose was 1250, because you need a high speed to use it in lower light. It chose a shutter speed of an 80th of a second and an aperture of f2.8. Now, there's not a lot of depth of field in that. Some things are out of focus, not much is in focus, but it's giving you a correct exposure, but not necessarily the correct creative exposure you want there. So that is giving me enough light to actually see what was in there. Changing from the wool shed to an antique shop on our way to our holiday. This was in a famous Cammy's antique shop near Paringa in South Australia in the Riverland. And the ISO that the camera chose on this occasion was 500, a shutter speed of an 80th of a second and an aperture of f4. And this was using my Olympus OMD EM5 Mark II camera that I've been using lately. And that is also got inbuilt image stabilization into that camera. So, but that was the settings that the camera chose automatically in there. And now I'm going to stop sharing and come back to me again. So that's just giving you a little bit of an insight into ISO, what it is. Don't be too scared of it. It's there to help you. It's an important part of the photographic triangle, which is the shutter speed and the aperture and the ISO. And all those things interact. And once you learn how to use them, interact them, you can be quite creative. But you can just choose to let your camera do everything for you and set everything to program. You might need to show, if you get a really good digital camera, you might need someone in the shop or someone to show you how to set it up in program so that it does everything automatically how you want it to. Sometimes people just use the green button that's on most digital cameras, but that doesn't cover every situation. I prefer to use the camera set on the program setting and then just slightly tweak some of the things to get what I want. So I hope you found that useful. Like if you like, subscribe if you wish, and I'll see you next time. What I'm doing next time is probably in the notes underneath. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you later.